The sun was just a smear of orange on the low horizon when the first silhouette slid across Henderson Field, slim, gull-winged shapes that seemed to float rather than charge. From the cockpit, the jungle ridge below looked small, like a model marked with tiny tents and clattering anti-aircraft guns. Marines on that ridge had been told to hold. Pilots were told to protect them. Above, the Japanese fighters moved with a liquid grace that made them look almost balletic in the brittle morning air. They were called Zeros, a name that carried a kind of lethal poetry: light, nimble, merciless. For American pilots in those early, raw months over Guadalcanal, the question was never just about speed or guns. It was about an aircraft that appeared to rewrite the rules of air combat and the men who had to face it. Guadalcanal was not an isolated scrap. It was a choke point on a map where strategy, logistics, and human will collided. Henderson Field sat like a razor on the island's spine. Whoever held it could interdict shipping, protect land forces, and project air power across the southern Solomons. When Marines seized the field, the island transformed into a prize and a target. Japanese commanders considered its loss intolerable. Their response was a steady drumbeat of effort to neutralize it, by sea and by air. The Tokyo Express would run at night to resupply and reinforce, while during the day, fighters and bombers attacked airstrips and shipping. For U.S. pilots, each mission was threaded into a larger story. Staying alive in the air mattered because the ground fight depended on it. The Zero, then, was not an abstract enemy. It was a machine that threatened the brittle axis of American operations at the edge of the Pacific. From the earliest reports and the accounts that filtered back to intelligence and briefing rooms, one characteristic rose above the rest: the Zero's maneuverability. It could outturn American fighters. Pilots noted, in dispatches, in debriefs, and in the steady hum of carrier decks, that when a Zero wanted to flatten a turn and keep you in its sights, it could do so with terrifying ease. That capacity to inside an opponent became the kernel of the Zero's reputation. It fed a narrative of spiritual superiority in Japanese arms, sometimes invoked as Yamato Damashi, a cultural phrase that outsiders interpreted as a kind of fighting spirit. But even as admiration and a grudging respect grew, an equally practical question lodged in the minds of many American pilots: how do you beat a plane that outturns you? The initial answers were mixed. On one level, there was awe. The Zero's lines, its climb, its ability to hold a sustained turn with little apparent penalty, these qualities impressed seasoned aviators who had flown against many types of opponents. Many U.S. pilots remembered the first time a Zero slipped into a corner and simply would not come out. In those cramped, violent seconds, options narrowed and fear widened.
For pilots raised on training that prized getting the nose on target and fighting a fight of position and persistence, the Zero introduced a problem that felt like a change in the rules. But admiration did not mean surrender. The men in the cockpits were professionals and improvisers. A reputation, no matter how well earned, is still a problem to be solved. The Americans began to watch the Zero not as a myth, but as a machine with trade-offs. Some of those trade-offs were technical, the result of design choices, and some were operational, the consequence of how the Imperial Japanese Navy deployed its fighters, how it trained pilots, and how it sustained them over an increasingly stretched supply line. It is important to be cautious here. Any technical assertion beyond the general point about maneuverability must be treated carefully. Certain commonly cited weaknesses, such as limited armor protection for the crew and fuel tanks lacking self-sealing features, are often discussed in histories of the war. Where such specifics do not appear in our primary island accounts, they should be regarded as indefinitive. Still, even a guarded reading of the situation suggests that the Zero's agility came at a cost. That cost revealed itself in the moments when combat moved beyond isolated dogfights. Guadalcanal imposed a set of operational realities that exposed the limits of an aircraft designed under a certain doctrine. The island campaign meant repeated sorties, close escort duties for bombers and transports, and a need to protect shipping lanes. Fighters that were built around maneuver tended to be optimized for a certain type of combat: short-range, decisive engagement, where staying in the fight to outturn an opponent is feasible. But maintaining control of the air over a contested island required endurance, survivability, and the capacity to adapt to mixed missions: interception, escort, strafing, and occasional ground support. As missions lengthened and attrition grew, the value of raw turning performance could be moderated by other demands. For American pilots, these were not simply academic considerations. They were lived, immediate decisions in the air. When a flight of Zeros came over, the instincts honed in training had to be adjusted. Some pilots pressed into turning fights at a cost. Others found that survival lay in refusing to get sucked into the Zero's strengths. From the earliest engagements, a pattern began to emerge. The tactical answer would be to deny the Zero what it wanted. If the enemy excelled in close-in turning fights, then keep the fight vertical and fast. That doctrine, in its simplest form, was the birth of energy tactics that would be refined over the months. Keep speed, trade altitude for advantage, and deliver a quick, powerful strike rather than a prolonged, slow duel. The phrase boom and zoom would come to sum up that approach.
The idea is straightforward and practical. Build potential energy at altitude, trade height for speed, then dive to make a high-speed firing pass on the enemy, using the speed to make an accurate burst, and then climb back to altitude before the opponent can respond. It is not a romantic maneuver. It is a mathematical one. Energy in the form of altitude and speed gives a pilot options. For an aircraft that turns tightly, meeting it with a high-speed slashing attack avoids the slow turn, preserves the attacker's energy, and reduces the risk of being trapped in someone else's turning circle. Boom and zoom requires discipline, attention to throttle and trim, and importantly, situational awareness, a luxury in chaotic air combat. Pilots adapted in other ways too. Teamwork and mutual support became essential counterweights to the Zero's advantages. Flying in pairs or in sections allowed American formations to present a complicating geometry to the enemy. One element could bait a turn, holding the Zero's attention, while another, positioned with altitude or speed, could deliver the fatal pass. Communication, shouted over the wind and the radio static, or transmitted through millisecond decisions, grew into a hard-won theater practice. Work together or die alone. Wingmen were not merely backup, they were insurance against being trapped in the Zero's strongest fight. Those tactical shifts altered pilots' subjective evaluations of the Zero. Where once the plane elicited a mix of admiration and dread, over time colors of certainty and adaptation replaced the basal fear. The Zero did not become any less graceful. It simply revealed a new set of vulnerabilities when faced with concerted, intelligent countermeasures and a broader operational context. And here, Guadalcanal's peculiar pressures played a role. The island demanded that fighters be not only duelists, but guardians of logistics. Protect the transports, keep Henderson Field operational, and the ground campaign could continue. In that task orientation, aircraft design trade-offs, the balance between agility and protection, between short-term dogfight superiority and long-term operational utility, mattered in new ways. There were also human factors at play. Pilot training, experience, and attrition shaped perceptions. Early in the Pacific War, the Japanese Navy aviation program had produced a cadre of skilled pilots, whose tactics and proficiency amplified the aircraft's strengths. As the war stretched on, attrition, the loss of experienced mentors, and the challenge of producing replacements began to erode that advantage. On the American side, too, experience accumulated, tactics were codified, and a steady ramp-up in training quality changed outcomes. Where pilots initially spoke of being outturned and outclassed, later reports shifted toward a tone of professional respect mixed with pragmatic confidence. But such statements must be couched carefully. It is incorrect to say all pilots felt the same way, or that an aircraft's reputation evaporated overnight. The shift was uneven, layered, and deeply contextual, a product of individual engagements, command decisions, and the grinding arithmetic of industrial capacity. Guadalcanal's ground campaign, the stubbornness of its defenders, and the vulnerability of Japanese supply lines fed directly into this aerial narrative. Marines like Alexander Vandergrift and leaders such as Merritt Red Mike Edson and John Basilone were central to holding the line. The air war existed to protect their efforts. When pilots intercepted enemy formations threatening Henderson Field, or when they harried the fast-moving destroyers and barges of the Tokyo Express, they were doing more than scoring victories in the air. They were preserving the means of continued resistance on the ground. That context mattered in how pilots judged the Zero. A beautiful turn in the sky could be tactically devastating, but strategically irrelevant if it did not stop the next resupply run. Conversely, a pilot who used boom and zoom to down a fighter before it reached the transports had delivered strategic value. Perception, then, was tethered to impact. What did this enemy plane allow the Japanese to do? What did it prevent the Americans from doing? Another practical reality that began to erode the Zero's aura was sustainment. Guadalcanal was a crucible to test not only tactics but logistics. Aircraft need parts, engines, trained maintainers, and fuel. Operating far from home bases required supply chains that could be interdicted, delayed, or exhausted. The Japanese supply effort, strained by naval losses and the vast distances of the Pacific, could not indefinitely match the industrial depth and logistical resilience that American forces were starting to bring to bear. Here again, caution is required. Any precise claim about specific spare part shortages or maintenance schedules on Guadalcanal is indefinable unless directly supported by the archive. But the larger pattern, that attrition and logistics would eventually weigh on the operational effectiveness of combat units, is a consistent theme in the island campaigns. For pilots, the flight line's viability mattered as much as the aircraft's wing design. An airframe that could outturn at the cost of increased maintenance or fragile systems would eventually show that fragility under sustained harsh conditions. Even so, these broader factors did not translate instantly into a lower estimation of the Zero among American flyers. Early impressions lingered because they were forged in moments of acute danger. And Ace's memory of being spun into a tail chase by a Zero did not evaporate simply because the strategic balance tilted later.
Perceptions matured unevenly. Younger pilots trained with the idea of energy tactics learned to treat the Zero as a problem to be managed. Veterans who had met it before retained a complex mix of respect and contempt for its limitations. Across squadron debriefs and the informal conversations over coffee and on carrier decks, the conversations moved from fearful tales of being outturned to tactical checklists: altitude, speed, teamwork, fire discipline. Technology mattered less in the pilot's everyday talk than practical survivability. How many rounds to fire in a burst? When to break off a chase? Which formations to fly over the field to maximize protection for the transports? Those were the questions that concrete experience answered out loud, not the abstract virtues of structural design. In the heat of combat, the pilot's judgment, shaped by training and by the examples of those who had survived, defined the aircraft's reputation more than any aerodynamic diagram. It's one thing to admire a machine from the ground, and another to face it with a scant handful of rounds and minutes of fuel. There were moments that crystallized these shifts in perception. A mission to intercept a bomber force might devolve into a tangled melee where turning fights favored the Zero. But when American fighters learned to position themselves at an energy advantage before the intercept, the same mission could become a lethal series of slashing attacks that left Zeros trailing smoke. Escorting transports demanded an even more punitive discipline. Fighters had to ensure the convoy's airspace was denied to enemy fighters by preempting them at altitude, not by waiting for them to dictate the terms. These operational lessons were absorbed quickly because the stakes were immediate and crucial. A single miscalculation could cost a transport, a supply load, or the lives of men whose boots were already in the mud defending Henderson Field. During this period, pilots' written and informal assessments began to feature a common refrain: respect the Zero's turning ability, exploit its weaknesses, and never fall in love with a dogfight you cannot control. The language was not uniform. It varied by unit, by theater, and by individual temperament. But the trend was discernible: tactical humility combined with doctrinal adaptation. The question of what did U.S. pilots really think admits both a collective answer and an array of private variations. For some, the Zero remained a symbol of elegance on the battlefield, a plane they would not relish facing again. For others, it became an opponent whose strengths had been mapped and whose weaknesses could be brought to bear by the will to adapt. As these tactical teachings spread, they were formalized into training and briefing. New squadrons arriving in the Pacific were taught to maintain energy, to use altitude as a form of insurance, and to avoid turning fights that matched the Japanese fighters' strengths.
The doctrine was not invented in a single room. It was written in the skies over Guadalcanal, in the narrow decisions of pilots who either survived or did not. Lessons accumulated in the wet pages of logbooks, in the tired laughter of aircrews, and in the sometimes brutal economy of combat. A maneuver that saved one pilot today would be repeated simply because the cost of learning otherwise was life. Yet for all that adaptation, there remained a central, almost wistful appreciation among pilots. The Zero was a beautifully designed machine for its intended purpose. That admission, made without romance and without political color, was part of the professional language of aviators. They could separate admiration for engineering and aerial grace from the tactical necessity of beating it. The distinction was crucial. Admiring an opponent did not preclude engineering a defeat. If anything, it sharpened the focus on practical weakness and how to exploit it. The morning patrols over Guadalcanal thus became laboratories of tactical evolution. Pilots flew missions that tested not only their mettle, but the doctrinal assumptions under which they fought. Each sortie was a datum: what worked, what failed, what had to be altered. When a squadron survived a day in the air, the post-sortie briefing was not merely an accounting of kills, it was a recalibration of doctrine. The Zero was, in many ways, the clearest teacher. It forced American airmen to ask different questions about how to approach air warfare in the Pacific, how to balance offensive aggression with the need to preserve an asset, how to integrate air operations into a land campaign that could not survive without them,
and how to design tactics that accounted for an enemy whose strengths lay where American designs were weakest. And so the perception of the Zero among U.S. pilots in those months of Guadalcanal was not monolithic. It was a layered, evolving assessment in which admiration for an audacious design sat atop hard-won procedural knowledge and a fast-growing institutional understanding. The plane's grace was acknowledged, its danger respected, and its vulnerabilities methodically catalogued and exploited. At the same time, Guadalcanal itself functioned as the crucible that forced that cataloging. The island's desperate geography, the Marines' stubborn defense, and the continual pressure on supply lines all ensured that air tactics could not remain theoretical. They had to succeed in practice. It is a mistake to reduce pilots' views to a single line. They neither idolized the Zero nor dismissed it as merely flawed. Instead, they formed a practical judgment born of repeated exposure, technical understanding, and the pressing demands of keeping men and material alive on a hostile island. That judgment would continue to evolve as seasons turned and as aircraft, pilots, and logistics changed.
But by the time the daily slugs of sorties had become routine, there was a clear, shared conviction among many American flyers. The Zero was formidable, yes, but beatable, provided you refused to play on its terms, and instead forced it into a fight it was not designed to win. What followed, as pilots would find, were vignettes of adaptation and consequence, sudden slashes from altitude that left enemy aircraft smoking, escorts that repelled interceptors before they could reach boats and transports, and the gradual accumulation of tactical knowledge that made each sortie incrementally safer. These episodes were not miraculous reversals, but steady, often grim reminders that in war, perception is forged at the edge of action. Over Guadalcanal, men in cockpits learned to turn a reputation into a problem to be solved. The island demanded results. Admiration alone would not keep the field in American hands. A few months into the campaign, the tone of pilot debriefs had shifted. Stories remained of close calls and of pilots outturned in the clear blue, but they were now balanced by accounts of maneuver discipline, altitude games, and teamwork that turned the tables. The Zero had taught hard lessons, and those lessons reshaped American air tactics. Behind the technical arguments and the tactical diagrams, however, there stood an undercurrent that would not be easily measured, the psychological effect of understanding an opponent. Where fear once loomed, professional competence began to take root. Pilots were still wary. Caution is the byproduct of respect. But that caution carried with it a new, operative confidence. They had ways to fight back. This story is about the shift from myth to method. It is about what U.S. pilots really thought as they moved from stunned admiration to tactical mastery. But Guadalcanal's arc would not be written in the air alone. The next episodes, the individual fights that turned into doctrine, the specific missions that saved a supply convoy, and the instances where the Zero's limitations were ruthlessly exploited, would continue the narrative. For now, the pictures of men in cockpits learning fast, of an island that demanded adaptation, and of an aircraft that, for all its grace, would be judged not only by how it flew, but by how it stood up to sustained integrated warfare. If you like deep World War II stories, hit subscribe. The mornings over Guadalcanal became a calendar of tension. Patrols that left in the violet half-light and returned with planes missing, radios silent, or with men simply not there to tell the story. From those sorties, small dramas played out that mattered far beyond a single aircraft falling into the sea. Consider 3 of the clearest vignettes that shaped how U.S. pilots thought about the Zero, and, through those judgments, how they fought.
The first is a mission you can imagine as a long, taut line on a briefing map, an inbound enemy strike approaching over the open water toward Lunga Point, SBDs and fighters threaded together, and a handful of Wildcats scrambled to meet them. The Wildcats climbed to higher altitude, a deliberate, uncomfortable ascent that traded fuel and time for the chance to dictate the terms of engagement. A section leader, eyes flicking across instruments and sky, held his wingmen tight. They were a compact geometry of wings and trust. When the Japanese fighters dropped into a defensive screen for the bombers, the Wildcats did not wheel into the blue to match turn for turn. Instead, they dove, a shrieking, violent descent, accelerating into a short, concentrated burst of fire meant to break the escort, not to sustain a fight. That dive and slash attack accomplished two things in the moment. First, it used speed as a blunt instrument, a rapid closure, a short window to aim cleanly and pull away. Second, it avoided the calculus the Japanese excelled at, the slow, grinding circle where the Zero could use its turn radius to trap an opponent. For the pilots who flew those intercepts, the sense hardened that the Zero's best environment was a certain kind of fight, and that you could deny it that environment by refusing to hand it the slow, angular duel it preferred. After-action talk among their crews, when it touched upon the Zero at all, now turned toward questions of timing, altitude control, and burst discipline, how many seconds to fire before braking, and where to reclaim height. The Zero had not ceased to be respected for its handling, but it was recast in pilots' minds as a piece on a chessboard, powerful within its role, but not the whole game. A second, more fraught vignette concerns the escort of transports running a daylight resupply. These missions had a different psychological pressure than a fighter versus fighter scrap. They were about protecting something fragile and necessary. Transports lumbered along, vulnerable to strafing and aerial attack, and the fighters assigned to their defense had to prevent interceptors from reaching those slow-moving targets. A few wildcats found themselves called in to interpose, to climb and hold a height advantage, and to block attackers before they could commit. Here, the tactical discipline of maintaining energy and position became a moral imperative as well as a technical one. A fighter breaking down into a turning fight to chase a tempting Zero might score a victory for itself, but at the cost of leaving a transport exposed. The calculus was stark. One pilot could have his name attached to a kill, or he could fail in his mission by not protecting the ship that carried ammunition, medical stores, and the food that kept Marines on the ridge alive. From the cockpits, pilots described an odd inversion of instinct. Training pushed toward aggressiveness. Find a target, fix it, finish it.
But the island demanded restraint and a new kind of discipline. Pilots who learned to hold altitude and to trade it for one decisive strike, who could break contact without succumbing to the Zero's temptation, came back with fewer aircraft and more survivors on the ground. The tactical lesson hardened into doctrine. Escorts exist to protect. Kills are a useful byproduct, not the mission. In the shared language of squadron bars and briefings, the Zero was increasingly synonymous with a test of restraint. Its turning ability made it seductive to the hot-handed pilot. The cupidity of the turn had to be mastered. The third vignette is not a single mission, but a sequence of engagements that together showed the Zero's vulnerabilities when confronted with coordinated American tactics and the cumulative weight of logistics. Imagine a day when multiple flights rendezvoused over the island. Fighters had been briefed to interdict incoming enemy raids, to screen transports, and to sweep the shipping lanes. One flight lured the enemy into a sympathetic position. Another, positioned higher, collapsed with speed. Choreography, more than solitary heroics, produced results. A Zero that might have proved lethal in a one-on-one turning duel found itself constrained by a geometry of altitude, speed, and mutual support. Pilots, when they spoke of these engagements, often used the language of practical problem-solving. He was in the turn, we had altitude. Give him a slashing burst, break away. The outcome of such fights was not a revelation about raw performance so much as an affirmation of doctrine. The Zero was still the plane many admired for its handling. It was no longer perceived as invulnerable to integrated tactics. Running through all three vignettes is the theme that experience altered opinion. At first, a Zero that could outturn a Wildcat seemed to many to demand a change in pilots themselves, more daring, quicker reflexes, or better gunnery. Then experience suggested that it was not the pilot who had to be remade so much as the doctrine and the formation. Pilots remembered, not as a romantic footnote, but as a tactical truth, that air combat over Guadalcanal rewarded position and energy more reliably than it rewarded match turning. Those who remained alive to tell the tale often told it not with bravado, but with the economy of practitioners describing a method that worked. What U.S. pilots really thought, therefore, was an evolving mix: admiration for what the Zero could do in the right circumstances, wariness born of the damage it had done, and an expanding confidence in systematic countermeasures that reduced the aircraft's advantages. This assessment grew in parallel with the hard realities on the flight line. Consider maintenance, the invisible partner of combat. Aircraft are not just machines in the air, they are machines on the ground, surrounded by men turning wrenches, cleaning spark plugs, and patching fabric and skin.
Guadalcanal's weather, tropical heat, sudden storms, salt air, punished airframes and engines. Spare parts could be delayed by enemy action, by the limitations of carrier logistics, or simply by the long supply chains that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The larger narrative of the Pacific is that these supply lines mattered to the outcome of air operations. Focusing on an opponent's handling without regard to whether its units could be maintained was to tell half the story. For pilots who visited the line frequently, planes that required more tender care or fragile components could prove a liability over time.
If an enemy fighter was magnificent in the air but arduous to sustain under prolonged stress, pilots understood that glory in a clean, isolated dogfight was not the same as sustained operational effectiveness. Here again, a caution in language is necessary. Specific claims about whether the Zero lacked certain protections or whether particular spare part bottlenecks occurred on a precise date need verification. Absent that, such technical statements should be treated as indefinido. What is safe to say, rooted in the island's context, is that sustainment and maintenance pressures shaped how pilots evaluated aircraft in the aggregate. It was not purely aerodynamics that governed opinion, but the practical question of whether a plane could be kept flying when the campaign demanded continuous sorties. Another factor, one less mechanical and more human, was the changing composition of the enemy's ranks. Early Japanese naval aviation boasted a corps of highly trained veterans whose skill magnified the Zero's advantages. Those veterans, experienced from the long pre-war training system and early Pacific campaigns, could apply the plane's handling in ways that made it feel like an extension of their own instincts. As the war ground on, attrition hollowed out that advantage. The loss of seasoned pilots, the accelerated training of replacements, and the overall strain on personnel meant that new airmen often lacked the depth of experience to exploit the Zero's strengths fully. On the American side, the opposite trend also unfolded. Experience accumulated among squadrons, tactics were codified, and training pipelines improved. For pilots over Guadalcanal, that shift mattered as much as any change in hardware. A Zero in the hands of a green pilot was not the same opponent as a Zero flown by an ace. Likewise, an American veteran flying energy tactics with discipline was a markedly different adversary than an inexperienced wingman. We must avoid the trap of turning this into a one-dimensional tale of mechanical failure or human superiority. The changing perceptions were neither instantaneous nor universally held. Plenty of pilots continued to speak of caution long after doctrine had matured and logistics began to favor the Allies. Memories of being outturned lingered. Trauma in combat does not dissipate like fog at noon.
What changed, incrementally and unevenly, was the balance of outcomes. A plane that had once dominated isolated duels became one of many factors in the complex calculus of island warfare. That complexity extended into the interplay between air operations and the ground campaign. The Marines holding Henderson Field, anchored by leaders such as Alexander Vandergrift, Merritt Red Mike Edson, and John Basilone, fought battles whose outcomes depended in part on whether aircraft could find and fend off threats. When Wildcat squadrons succeeded in repelling an interceptor at the right altitude, infantrymen below got another day of supply and breath. When opponents penetrated cleanly, a supply ship might be damaged or a runway cratered, and the ripple effects could be immediate and severe. Pilots, therefore, increasingly judged aircraft not by their graceful flight alone, but by their capacity to affect ground outcomes. The question of what did U.S. pilots think thus always folded back into a larger operational ledger. Did this plane, flown by this opponent, allow the Japanese to do something decisive on the ground? The answer shaped the tone of pilots' assessments far more than abstract technical admiration. Another thread in pilots' evolving impressions was the psychological one, learning to be less afraid. That phrase seems simple but carries a heavy weight. Fear is not merely an emotional reaction. It is a cognitive load that degrades decision-making. The earliest months over Guadalcanal were full of small, high-risk experiments and tactics, each one taken under fire. Surviving a fight after applying the boom and zoom technique, or surviving because wingmen held station while a leader made the decisive pass, had a feedback effect. Confidence grew. Confidence, in turn, produced cleaner split-second choices in the air. With cleaner choices came more favorable outcomes. Over time, the stories that passed among pilots shifted from narrow tales of being outmatched to reports of tactical success and operational discipline. That shift did not erase respect for the Zero's strengths. It balanced it with a seasoned belief that, given the right approach, that aircraft could be beaten. This evolution in outlook had consequences beyond the immediate circle of pilots and their squadrons. Commanders, hearing the repeated accounts that emphasized energy tactics and the necessity of mutual support, began to shape deployments and training to favor those approaches. Air doctrine was not static, it fed up and down the chain. New pilots received briefings that included practical instructions born of Guadalcanal's hard lessons. Maintain altitude where possible, avoid protracted turning engagements, use wingmen to hold attention, and never allow a transport or bomber to be left exposed by a single pilot's pursuit. Those were not glamorous orders, they were survival truisms.
In classrooms and on carrier decks, doctrines that had been expensive to discover were passed along more cheaply to later arrivals. In that way, judgment about the Zero moved from personal anecdote to institutional knowledge. As the campaign progressed, two broader realities cemented into the pilots' assessments. First, that the Zero's remarkable handling was a tactical feature, not a strategic guarantee. It could dominate in certain fights and under specific conditions, but it could not by itself secure control of an island or win a campaign that required sustained logistics, airbase maintenance, and coordinated operations. Second, that American industrial depth and evolving tactics increasingly told on the balance. Aircraft production, pilot training pipelines, and material sustainment began to outpace the Japanese capacity to replace losses or to supply distant operations with the same consistency. Here again, precise claims about production figures or the timing of industrial shifts are matters for archival verification, and where not directly supported by the immediate island accounts, should be considered indefinito. What pilots experienced palpably and every mission was the practical effect. They could expect to see reinforcements, parts, and replacements arrive with growing reliability as the campaign matured, and that perception shaped their willingness to commit to certain kinds of risk. There were, naturally, cultural overtones to the conversation about the Zero. Early American briefing rooms sometimes described the enemy's prowess in language that drifted toward myth. Phrases referencing Yamato Damashi or the notion of an indomitable national spirit occasionally appeared in informal talk and in press reports, and those ideas could amplify fears. Pilots, who had the blunt task of deciding in seconds whether to turn or to dive, were often skeptical of romantic explanations. They preferred to evaluate cause and effect. For many, the mythical language served as a placeholder for a real tactical problem: how to beat an aircraft that turned inside you. Once tactics met that problem with reliable solutions, talk of spiritual superiority became less relevant in the pilot's practical lexicon. They still acknowledged cultural factors where appropriate, but battlefield learning tended to flatten rhetoric into procedure. By the end of the hard months over Guadalcanal, a balanced summary of pilots' thinking emerges. Respect for the Zero's handling remained, because admiration for a well-made instrument is part of aviators' DNA. That admiration sat alongside a pragmatic recognition of the aircraft's limits and of the reasons those limits mattered: sustainment, pilot experience, tactical context, and the strategic purpose of operations. Pilots' judgments were not static pronouncements but living assessments, updated with each sortie.
That is an important point. What U.S. pilots really thought was not a single monolithic sentiment, but an ongoing conversation conducted in the air and at the flight line, in squadron bars and in debrief rooms. It was alternately fearful, respectful, analytical, and ultimately confident. It is tempting to reduce this to a simple moral: a machine is only as decisive as the doctrine and logistics that support it. But the human stories resist such simplification. The pilots who flew those missions were more complex than heraldry or a one-line assessment. They admired skill even in an adversary. They mourned friends and felt the weight of responsibility for men on the ground. They learned, adapted, and sometimes failed. Their evolving opinions about the Zero tell us about adaptation under pressure, about how professional communities respond to novel threats, and about the way perception hardens into doctrine when survival depends on it. Guadalcanal, in the larger sweep of the Pacific Campaign, was where those perceptions were tested fiercely and fast. The island forced a reckoning. The graceful enemy aircraft that once seemed to rewrite air combat had to confront the realities of sustained operations, combined arms, and an opponent willing to change its methods. In that crucible, the Zero's legend was not so much shattered as reframed. For U.S. pilots, the story moved from awe to appraisal to action. They did not return to the naive confidence that any new opponent could be dismissed. Rather, they gained a measured assurance that a plane's reputation is a starting point for tactical inquiry, not the final word. If you look back across the months of air operations and the accumulating reports, a through line appears. Pilots judged the Zero by what it enabled the Japanese to do strategically, and by how manageable it became under American adaptations. Where once the sight of a gull-wing silhouette induced immediate alarm, later it elicited a quick tactical calculation. What is its altitude? Who's in position? Where can we make a clean pass? That calculation, more than any single kill score, encapsulates what U.S. pilots really thought. They had come to see the Zero as formidable in specific contexts, but not invincible, to respect it without allowing respect to paralyze action, and to convert fear into doctrine. That conversion had long-term consequences beyond Guadalcanal. The tactical lessons learned there, the emphasis on energy tactics, tight wingman discipline, and mission-focused restraint, spread through the Pacific theaters, influencing how subsequent squadrons were trained and how air operations were conducted. Pilots who cut their teeth over Lunga Point carried those lessons with them, teaching newcomers and codifying doctrine that would be used in later engagements. Guadalcanal thus stands as both a battlefield and a classroom. It tested machines and men, and it taught methods that would shape the air war.
As the campaign receded into history, veterans' conversations about the Zero remained nuanced. Some recalled its beauty in flight.
others the terror of a turn that left no apparent escape. Many remembered the hard, practical work of learning to fight differently. Across all those recollections, a common thread was clarity. The enemy airplane was not a magical invincibility, but a challenge to be met with tactics, teamwork, and stubborn persistence. In the end, that measured approach, the refusal to accept intimidation as destiny, is perhaps the most telling verdict pilots rendered. So, when the question returns, what did U.S. pilots really think about Japanese Zero fighters? The answer lies in a composite judgment. They thought the Zero was an exceptional piece of engineering, especially in terms of agility and handling. Many pilots respected that quality, and at times feared it. Yet that admiration did not prevent them from analyzing and exploiting the aircraft's operational vulnerabilities, whether those vulnerabilities were inherent in design choices or emerged because of logistical and training limitations. Specific technical claims that are not clearly documented here remain indefinitive. Their practical verdict became, respect the Zero, but do not let its reputation dictate your tactics. Use altitude and speed, fly as a team, protect transports, and above all, understand that victory requires more than isolated duels. Guadalcanal taught a broader lesson about myth and reality. The aura surrounding the Zero had both cultural and technical elements, but on the ground and in the air, it was battlefield results that mattered. When a formation of wildcats denied an enemy fighter the chance to shape the fight, when an escort held a transport's airspace, when pilots returned with aircraft intact and missions accomplished, perception shifted. Mythic invincibility gave way to a sober, professional assessment. The Zero was beatable, and the means to do so were practical, teachable, and repeatable. The island's defenders, the airmen who covered them, and the logistic efforts that sustained both would continue to shape the campaign long after the gull-wing silhouettes had stopped appearing over Henderson Field. The pilots' evolving views were part of that larger story, a story about adaptation, about the limits of romantic explanations in war, and about how professional communities convert respect for an adversary into tactical knowledge that saves lives. In that sense, the Zero's reputation served a useful purpose. It forced innovation and discipline, and the way U.S. pilots reacted to it tells us not only about an aircraft, but about the character of combat itself. If this account has resonated with you, leave a comment. Which World War II aircraft's reputation would you like us to unpack next? Share a memory or an insight, and subscribe to keep exploring the tangled, human stories behind hardware and legend.